What's up, Shred Sexies? Welcome back. Down to the fingers. We're going to be getting into adding arpeggios to your everyday solos and improvisations, also as a sort of a melodic tool rather than just a soloing tool. And you see me kind of incorporate that in the intro solo where I start off with the major going into the 5 chord at the Locrian position and then diving down to Aeolian. Notice how I'm just climbing down diatonically. I go from Ionian into Locrian into Aeolian and end in Mixolydian, but at Aeolian and Mixolydian I'm doing the minor 7 from the dominant 7 inversion family. So I think you're starting to get the idea here. I start to do this big sequence with the arpeggios, which is one of the big ones you need to understand about using arpeggios. Arpeggios on their own, pretty cool. In conjunction with a scale or something else, also very cool. But when you start to use them to sort of create this flip-flopping effect with other arpeggios, that honestly is the best. And there are a whole bunch of different ways of doing that. So don't think that this is, the be-all, end-all. This is just like honestly opening the door a little tiny bit. So there's so much more after this, but this is the easiest way if you want to, sort of encompass this idea. So we're going to go over the basics here, obviously, with respect to the triad arpeggios, and then we're going to look at some examples there, and then I'm going to talk a little bit at the end with respect to combining the ideas together to create the synergy between the arpeggio sequence and then the scale sequence. So you can see, again, there's this sort of balancing act. If I did too many arpeggios, not so good, but once I start to reinforce that little arpeggio sequence with the scale sequence, using the minor pentatonic scale and the 3 notes per string from the major modes, well, bam, Bob's your uncle. So let's get into it. All right, when it comes to soloing, obviously you got to have tools in the toolbox. So this is a very, very short and sort of condensed list of the essential arpeggio information you're going to need to know. So which is essentially the major inversions, the minor inversions based on a major scale. So in this case, G major, and I do G major and E minor. And you can hear me sort of ascend using the majors and then descend using the minors. And you can flip them around, of course. And then you can start to do other things like ascend using a major, and where there's a minor that intersects at the same position, then come back down using the minor. That's also a very useful tool. But the thing is that you start to hear this synergy going on between the major and the minor. And so that's very important that you actually start to seize upon that as far as the ear training is concerned. One of the most important things to do with respect to this whole exercise, if you will, is to train your ears, and basically moving from all those major inversions to playing the minor ones like I do in the example, very useful. Of course, there's a diminished sequence, moving all over the place in minor thirds. That should be the goal here. Don't just concentrate on the shape. Obviously, that's important too, but the idea that diminished is just a bunch of minor thirds stacked on top of each other, and then you can get more fancy from there, but for all intents and purposes, that's it. And so being able to see the fretboard broken down into little minuscule chunks of minor thirds, either on 1 string, 2 strings, or whatever it is, or if you jump across strings, you might get past a third, obviously getting into tenths, right? Like a minor 10 or something like that. So you can see that can be actually pretty useful. So, obviously just learning the standard patterns are going to be useful, but instead also try to memorize this idea that you're just moving in thirds, and then try to identify, you're like, okay, that's a third too, but it's like the tritone. And then that'll get you thinking, and that's important. When you're practicing and you're actually thinking, you stop there for a second, you try to consider what it is that you're doing. That's insanely useful, obviously, because you're actually going through the process of training yourself. That's the most important part, right? And last but not least, of course, is the diatonic sequence, where I just ascend using every step of a major scale, the 1st degree all the way through to the 7th. And of course, the corresponding sort of arpeggio that goes with it, or chord in this case, which is going to be major for the 1st degree, minor for 2 and 3, major for 4 and 5, minor for 6, diminished for 7, and then of course I'm back to the start again at major which is 1 again. So that's very important too. So if you're working on sort of incorporating these arpeggios into your everyday practice sessions and your solos and stuff like that, that's got to be step number 1, is just really hunker down and just get this under your belt. And the faster you can do that and reconcile it, if you will, especially with respect to these inversions and the cage system with chords, that would be very useful to you. I think you'll be well ahead of the game. And then after we look at these examples, I'll have a little bit at the end there where we talk about just putting the ideas together with the scales. All right, the soloing with the arpeggios, essentially, you got 2 choices here, really. And these are the most logical sort of practice scenarios, which are going to be using them as cadences and then using them as sequences with a diatonic scale. So in the example, at the beginning, I use a diatonic scale. I go from the 1 chord down to the Locrian position where I play the 5 chord. In this case, it goes from C major to G major. Then I jump down to the 6th chord, which is going to be A minor, and I play a minor 7. And then I play another inversion, the 3rd inversion, at the Mixolydian position of the minor 7. So in this case, it's also A minor 7. A minor 7 twice to make one big, giant A minor 7 arpeggio. Right, but it sounds pretty interesting, essentially, because the chord underneath it moves. So I think it does. I can't remember exactly, but it sounded right at the time. So there it is. That's the idea of a sequence. Of course, the cadence itself, I'm also doing at the very beginning where I do the 1 to 5. That's a perfect cadence, right? You could do 1-6, minor cadence, 1-4, plagal cadence. There's a whole bunch of them. So figure out which one sort of floats your boat and then get on it. Of course, the other thing I didn't actually use was a lot of diminished. I didn't want to, take it to an extreme. But balancing out the ideas of arpeggios with scales obviously is very useful. Number 1, you put on the hat of thinking about scales and breaking down the fretboard with respect to that information. And then you take that hat off and you put on your arpeggio hat. And then all of a sudden your thinking switches over to the arpeggio thinking. And trust me, once you start digging into this stuff, you will want to sort of separate out that much and be like, okay, this is just the arpeggio stuff, and then get good at building bridges between this information. Okay, when I want to use 3 and 1 here from the scale stuff and pair it up with this dominant 7 arpeggio sequence over here, let's see how that goes. And think of it as like building that bridge in real time. So you got this little team of people that are just like super fast at building bridges or whatever. So you just run over there and just whip it all up, and there you just go from one idea to the next. That's a lot easier said than done. So that's what you're looking at. Basically, the idea that you're going to create a sequence, you're going to use a cadence, and you're going to practice that to train your ear. Diatonically, of course, and the cadences to sort of appreciate this resolution effect that you get from a minor to a major, from diminished to major, from dominant 7 to major. That's very important. I didn't actually understand how important that was. Whoops. And last but not least, after you get these arpeggios sort of up to standard to a certain degree, instead of just concentrating, getting into practice hell and, you know, trying to get the super shred going on, instead combine them immediately with scales to try to balance the two ideas out. So just constantly bounce back between doing an arpeggio sequence and then doing a scale sequence, doing maybe some bluesy arpeggios and doing the blues scale, and then do some really weird arpeggios like augmented and major minor 7 or major sharp 5 or whatever it is, and flop over to the melodic minor. I think you're starting to get the picture here. You can use the same principle and then just swap in a new system of scales like the melodic minor, harmonic minor, make the conversions with respect to the arpeggios, and make a few conversions as well, just to smooth out some of the rough edges, and boom, you got a whole new tool to play with. Again, it's up to you. You got to use your imagination and start breaking this information down and being like, come up with your own sense of how to come up with a really creative practice idea so you can start to use this stuff immediately, so that when you're just playing along with music, you're like, now's the time to play that right now. And you do it. And everybody in the band's like, okay, so you want to be that guy? Start hitting these arpeggios. We'll see you in the next one.